Welcome to Darshan America, folks. We come to you from Washington, D.C. My name is Ramesh Bhutani.
And I'm Asta Verma.
You know, my mother used to say that if you come into the room and two people are arguing, generally 5 minutes in the argument, you cannot tell who's right and who's wrong. And you generally cannot tell who started the fight. But it's still going on, the blame game in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, the 401k of everyone has hit smack in the ground. And I want to tell you, everyone is angry. You know, everybody is angry because no one is really taking the responsibility that they did it. And it seems like, you know, managers, when you hire them, there's only one requisite. You should be able to see far in the distance. That is the job of the manager. And Republicans and Democrats, I mean, they get an enormous amount of money and prestige and everybody's prayers, but they can't even see 3 months in front of them.
And that's why we got downgraded. I mean, it should be no surprise to us that the S&P decided to lower our credit rating from AAA to AA+. Now, I know you said last week that this was the new 40 and that the world wouldn't care if we got downgraded, but the reality is the world did care. And the markets, not just the U.S. Dow Jones International, which fell 635 points earlier in the week, you're seeing all kinds of volatility across all the markets. You're seeing them across Asia, across Europe, and it's a ripple effect. And I think the S&P, even though they received some criticism now for having done this in spite of the debt deal, right? I mean, we all were hoping that the debt deal, ugly as it was, would have avoided this circumstance. And the reality is it didn't. Even though the S&P took a lot of criticism for this, in some ways I think they did the right thing because they told the entire three-party mess that we have today that, look, this is serious, this is for real, and if it happens this way in a continuing fashion that we have to struggle every time to make simple decisions, simple logical decisions about our budget and our outlook, just what you're saying, and if we can't get there in a good political fashion, of course there's a loss of confidence.
What they say, they light a fire under their feet, and that's
right.
How they came in. Even though I don't agree with S&P. You know, if you're going to make a $2 trillion mistake just in the numbers alone, it will just require you to say, hey, take it easy. Let's see what other things the administration has got to say.
I have to ask myself this question. I'll ask you this question. Do you think that this whole debt deal and the impact it has had would have been fully recognized if S&P had not made this move? We would have brushed it under the carpet and said, oh, it's over for now. Let's forget about it for the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, next election cycle, and here we go again. This
true.
Forces us to make solid decisions and to think about our political process, which is broken.
I liked Senator Alan Simpson. He did a little essay in the Bloomberg Business Week. You remember Ishkin Bowles and Alan Simpson were hired as the co-chairs for fiscal responsibility and reform team that President Obama installed. But at the same time, when they came out with the report, President Obama just shelved it, did not use it.
And he got a lot of criticism for it.
Yeah, he wrote a wonderful essay. The first thing he said is, please pray for the super committee. You hope they're successful, but they should not go for the low-hanging fruit of $1.2 or $1.5 trillion. They should go for much more. The debt we owe is $14 trillion right now, but $1 trillion deficit every year, you're going to be in $20 trillion in no time at all. And when you try to cut $20 trillion, he said anybody who thinks they're not going to touch Social Security, they're not going to touch Medicare, they're not going to touch Defense Department, they're not going to touch taxes, they're not going to do revenue enhancing and others, smoking dope. Because these things, the amount of money that you have, he said, the committee will first try to be very innovative, very clever. But pretty soon they'll come across, this is a huge big wall. The only way you're going to dismantle it is by actually using certain tools. So, this Senator Alan Simpson, I really liked him. He was the senator from 79 to 97. So he was there when President Reagan was there. He said, the flamethrowers, of course he was talking about Miss Backman. And he said, flamethrowers will tell you President Reagan never raised taxes. He said he raised taxes 11 times in 8 years. I served with him. I know the man. That's what he did. And he said he was the biggest negotiator in the world. And here Bachmann is saying, no negotiations. We're not going to raise the debt. And one other thing that he said, he says, there's going to be no sacred cows. For instance, he talked about the military is a fantastic community in the United States. I mean, they sacrifice their lives. Everybody loves them. He said, but they only pay $470 a year for their medical insurance, not only for themselves, but also their dependents and their family. $470, and they pay no co-payment. He said, but the minute you say, well, they have to raise that, and Robert Gates, the former defense secretary, he told Alan Simpson that they're going to take your hide. He talks the same way about the Social Security. If you talk about raising 1 year from the age of 67, you take the retirement to age 68 in 2050. And he says all the old people will come in and say, you're robbing us, you're going to starve us to death. He said that is the atmosphere that these guys are going to have to work with.
You know, interesting you should say that, because I read an article by Fareed Zakaria in Time magazine, and he touched on many of the same points that Alan Simpson did. Same thing he says, look, you know, anybody looking at this problem comprehensively is going to realize that you can't get there without doing both, cutting from these programs as well as raising taxes. You have to do both.
That's right.
We don't have the luxury of just doing one side of the equation. And that's pretty much what we got out of the debt deal. We didn't get to those revenues. And, you know, he also said a couple of other interesting things. You know, he always looks at things from a global perspective.
Yeah.
And so he made an interesting comparison. He said American parties now function like European parliamentary ones, which were always ideological in nature, right? But the U.S. system is very different from parliamentary systems, because whereas a parliamentary system, what it does is it just says, okay, you're going to get this brand of government, and this brand of government has control over both the legislative and the executive branches. So you have to live with all their policies. There is no negotiation. And if you don't like their policies, you can throw them all out in the next election cycle and take the other